Shalom, welcome to Gefet in the Daf. I'm Yael Shimoni, bringing to you together with Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha, learning Daf Yomi, and learning a bit of Rishonim on your Daf Yomi, taking learning deeper. And today I'm translating the Shir of Rabbanit Yael. I highly recommend also to listen to her in Hebrew. And we're dealing with a question that might seem a little far from us. Can an Eved bring a get or accept a get? Can he become a Shaliach for Gitin, either for the husband or for the wife? And why are we interested in Navadim? What kind of information we'll be able to get out of here? So we will see that we'll have very interesting svarot, really pointing out more issues about what is it Shliach Kabbalah, what is Shliach Holacha, and also interesting things about how can you become a Jew if you're an Eved, a full Jew, and if you're a Goy. So that's at the end of the Gefet. So let's begin. And I'm really saying that even though we're learning Avadim, there's something very interesting that we have to see how this is an opening to understanding other aspects that we are more interested and familiar with in the Masechet. So we're beginning with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is as follows and has, if you'll notice, an interesting line in it. Hakol ksherim lehavi et haget, chutz micheresh, shote vekatan vesuma ve'oved kochavim. So what is interesting here? Well, many things. The list is interesting, and is the list inclusive of all the issues that we're interested in? But the main point I want to point here is that the Mishnah uses a word that we don't recognize. Hakol ksherim lehavi et haget. Everybody's kasher to bring the get. What does it mean, bring the get? We know of two different kinds of sides in this get. The husband and the wife. The husband sends the get, and the wife accepts the get. No one of them is bringing the get. And since the Mishnah here is talking about bringing, we have a question. Is it describing the shaliach of the husband? And the word bringing really means sending, and that's shliach holacha here. Or maybe this is a different type of shaliach, shliach haba'ah, which means he's not the shaliach of the husband, exactly. He's not the shaliach of the wife. He's just a way to make the distance shorter. So that's a question that we have in reading the Mishnah. Let's continue because we're working in the Pshat. The end of the Sugya, there's a question to Rabbi Ami. Ba'u minei mi Rabbi Ami. Eved, ma'u sheyaseh shaliach lekabel get isha miyad ba'ala. Okay, so the question to Rabbi Ami is about a different shaliach. Question to Rabbi Ami, an Eved, mahu sheyaseh shaliach lekabel. Can he be a shaliach to accept the get? And as we mentioned before, we have shaliach holacha, which is sending the get, the shaliach, which is instead of the husband. We have shaliach kabbalah, which is a shaliach instead of the wife. And we had the shaliach hava'ah, that we weren't sure who he was. The Mishnah spoke about shaliach holacha or hava'ah. And the question is regarding Shliach Kabbalah, which is a different Shaliach. It's the Shaliach that's instead of the wife and not instead of the husband. Does this make a difference? Let's see. What is the answer of Rabbi Ami? Amar lehu midekapasi le'oved kochavim michlal de'eved kasher. Rabbi Ami says, since we learned in the Mishnah that one of the psulim is goy, and a goy, an oved kochavim, is worse than an eved. So if an oved kochavim is pasul, and the Mishnah didn't see a need to say that also an eved is pasul, it means that an eved is kasher. So what is Rami Abi saying here? That an eved can be a shaliach to accept the get instead of the wife. Okay, he can be a shaliach for the wife, shaliach kabbalah. And we learned that from the Mishnah because the Mishnah, even though it discussed a different shaliach, shaliach holacha, still it's the same discussion. That's what it seems from what Rabbi Ami is saying. And since the Mishnah listed Dafka, Oved Kochavim, we learned that an Eved is kasher. In the continue of the Gemara, we see that Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Rabbi Ami. And he says, I don't think that the way you learned the Mishnah is right. In what sense? Amar, Rabbi Yochanan, en ha'eved na'asta shaliach lekabel get la'isha miyad ba'ala, lefi she'eno b'torat gitin ve'kiddushin. So, Rabbi Yochanan thinks that an Eved is pasul for a different reason. Why wasn't he listening to the Mishnah? That's a good question for Rabbi Yochanan. But Rabbi Yochanan says an Eved doesn't have an ability to be Megarish and Mekadosh himself. And we have a rule in Shlichut that in order to be a shaliach, you have to have the same ability as the meshalech. You have to have the same ability as the person who sent you, at least the same theoretical ability. And an eved is lacking that in gitin v'kiddushin. Rabbi Elazar asks Rabbi Yochanan is matkif, asking a question. You're saying, Rabbi Yochanan, tama b'milta deleite, ha b'milta deite kasher. If what you're saying is right, then things that the Eved can do, he will be able to do. But let's look at Oved Kochavim. V'ha Oved Kochavim, v'ha kuti, de'itnu b'torat truma denafshayu. Detnan, Oved Kochavim והכותי שתרמו משלהם תרומתם תרומה. ותנן, עובד כוכבים שתרם של ישראל, אפילו ברשות אין תרומתו תרומה. מאי תאמה? לאו משום דכתיב, אתם, גם אתם, מה אתם ישראל, אבשולכם ישראל? So what is the kushia of Rabbi Elazar? Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Yochanan, you had an assumption that in order to be a shaliach of someone, I have to have the same halachic ability as he has. But, says Rabbi Elazar, we know that Ovdei Kochavim and Kutim do have an ability to do Trumot u'Ma'asrot, and still they cannot do Trumot u'Ma'asrot for Israelites. So that proves, Rabbi Yochanan, that your statement is wrong, because here we see the same halachic ability, that if Ovdei Kochavim can do it for themselves, they can do Trumot u'Ma'asrot, and still they cannot be shlichim for people from Israel. So obviously what you said that you have to have the same ability is not the reason why an Eved cannot be part, because that's not the same problem. We see that Ovdei Kochavim can, and still they're not allowed. So obviously Ovdei Kochavim have a different issue, because Ma atem Israel, af shluchechem Israel. Amre dever Rabbi Yanai lo. Ma atem bnei brit, af shluchechem bnei brit. What is the answer of Rabbi Yanai? He says there are two criteria that you have to check before you become a shaliach. First, you have to be ben brit. Let's check that. And in that, goyim are not bnei brit. Avadim are bnei brit. Second question is, once you're a ben brit, do you have the same halachic ability? And here, Rabbi Yochanan is right. Goyim are not, avadim are not bedin begerushim. And that's why they cannot be a shaliach for somebody who's not an Eved, who's a full Jew. So we see that in order to become a shaliach, you have to have two different criteria. One, bnei brit, and the other to have the same halachic ability. So, as we see, there's a machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami thought that an Eved is kasher to be shliach Kabbalah. Rabbi Yochanan thinks that an Eved is puzzled to be shliach Kabbalah, because Rabbi Yochanan thinks you have to have the same halachic abilities. And, as it sounds, Rav Asi does not have that same criteria as Rabbi Yochanan. So up till now, we saw that the sugya brought us a few interesting points. The first point is that Goyim don't have any shlichut at all. They cannot be a shlichim for Israelites at all, and maybe they cannot be even shlichim for one another. That's a different sugya. Avadim can be shlichim theoretically. Now we have to check what kind of ability they have to see if they can be my specific shaliach. And that's what we learned from the discussion between Rabbi Asi and Rabbi Yochanan. Up till now, we only did Pshat Gemara. There was a lot to learn here. Now let's move to the Rishonim. So the Rishonim, as we mentioned before, noticed that we have here different words that seem to be describing different types of shlichim. Holacha, Hava'ah, and Kabbalah. The beginning of the sugya, the Mishnah spoke about Hava'ah, which sounds maybe like Holacha. But the question that Rabbi Ami was asked was about Kabbalah. Holacha and Hava'ah are from the side of the husband. Kabbalah is from the side of the wife. Is there a difference between these two shlichuyot? So, as we saw, Rav Ami, he thought that if you can be a shliach holacha, you can be a shliach Kabbalah. And this is what Rashi says about Rabbi Ami. Batehem megoreshet bekabalato, vehu hadin nami leholacha, dekula chada te'amahi, elakach hayta hashela bebet hamidrash. So Rashi here has a few interesting things that he's saying. He's saying Rabbi Ami, when he read the Mishnah, he obviously thought that Shliach Kabbalah and Shliach Holacha are exactly the same. And it's true that the Mishnah spoke about Shliach Holacha, and the question evolved Shliach Kabbalah. But since they have the same din, it makes a difference, and that's why Rabbi Ami could learn from the Mishnah to the question. So, still, why did the Gemara use different terms? Why is it using Kabbalah here and Holacha there? Says Rashi, Hulacha datamahi ela. This is a very surprising Rashi. Rashi says the reason why people are asking Rabbi Ami about Shliach Kabbalah, it's just because that's what they were learning then. And the reason that they used Shliach Kabbalah is because that's how a student put up his hand and asked, wait, about Shliach Kabbalah. But it's not an indication that there's a difference between Shliach Kabbalah and Holacha. No, they're exactly the same. So that's the shita of Rashi in reading the difference between the beginning of the sugya and the end of the sugya. If we'll look at the Pnei Yoshua, we'll see that he has different understanding in the sugya. The Pnei Yoshua here he's an Achron, of course, and he has a long discourse on this passage of the Gemara. And he says two different ideas, one in the first beginning of his statements and the other at the end. And we'll learn both. What is the same in whatever the Pnei Yoshua will say is that he disagrees with Rashi. Rashi thought that Shliach Kabbalah and Shliach Holacha have the same din. Pnei Yoshua thinks, no, they're different. In what way are they different? At the beginning of his words, he will say one thing. At the end, he will give a different option. So let's see the beginning. It says the Pnei Yoshua, Umishliach Kabbalah, nami lo matzina lemelach, דכיוון דמתגרשת בעל כורחה, לא אכפת להם כל כך בשליחות, ואפילו זה רק לחצרה מהנה. Says the Pnei Yoshua, how can Rabbi Ami learn from Shliach Holacha to Shliach Kabbalah? I'll tell you, says the Pnei Yoshua, because there's a kal v'chomer here. Shliach Holacha, that's a serious shliach. When a husband sends a get to his wife, he has to have ratzon and dat, and this shliach has to be somebody who is enabled to embody all of his ideas and his wants and his mind. But what is Kabbalah? Ha'isha mitgareshet be'al kocha. The woman will be megoreshet even if she doesn't want. Of course, in the Oraita, as we will see in the Masechta. And since that is the case, a shaliach Kabbalah is something very, very low. Even a piece of ground of the woman can be mekabel to get for her. So obviously, a person who has no need to show any want or idea can just be as passive as she is. So if a shaliach can be a shaliach holacha, kal v'chomer, that he can be a shliach Kabbalah. Shliach Kabbalah is less than shliach holacha, and that's how he understands Rabbi Ami's statement. But what does Rabbi Yochanan think? So the Pnei Yoshua at the end says maybe the machloket between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yochanan has to do also with understanding what is Shliach Holacha and Shliach Kabbalah. And this is what the Pnei Yoshua says at the end of his words. He returns to Sugya and Kiddushin that is very important to learning here in Yanei Shlichut. Sugya and Kiddushin also discusses how do we learn Shlichut, and it gives a different pasuk to learning Shliach Holacha and a different pasuk to learning Shliach Kabbalah. And the Pnei Yoshua says, Elaha de'it tzarich kra leha-isha osa shaliach, והיינו משום דמשלוחו לא ידינן לדשליחות מהנה בעלמא, ונגמר בדיבור להיות עשייתו כעשיית הבעל דבר. תתי לא שמינן באישה דכתיב ונתן בה בידה, ומהכיתית דנאמר ביד השליח מקרא ידה ממש. Says the Pnei Yoshua, why did the Gemara need to bring two different psukim? One to teach us that a person can be a shaliach for the husband, and the other to teach us that a shaliach can be a shaliach for the wife. If what Rabbi Ami thought is true, that if I learn about shliach holacha, then I can also learn about shliach Kabbalah, we wouldn't need two psukim. So if we do need two psukim, that proves that there is a difference, and actually shliach Kabbalah is something much more radical than shliach holacha. To take the place of the husband, that's easy to understand. To take the place of the wife, for that you have to have another pasuk. Why? Because the shaliach of the husband is doing a deed in his name. He is being sent to do something specific, something active. And that is the kind of shaliach he is. He's actually doing a deed in the name of the husband. But since the wife here is not doing any deed, and acceptance is not a deed, it's even against her will, then in order to change her place, you have to have a chidush that a person can become another person's body. To become another person's body is something much more radical than to do something in a person's name. And that's why Shliach Kabbalah is a much bigger chidush and a much stronger chidush than Shliach Holacha. So if the Mishnah spoke about Shliach Holacha, there is still no way to prove from that Shliach Kabbalah will work in the same way. So that's why Rabbi Ami's learning is not so easy. And that's how we can also understand why Rabbi Yochanan is cholik on Rabbi Ami. So what did we see up till now? That the maskana of the sugya, who is right, Rabbi Ami or Rabbi Yochanan, is a shaliach holacha, like a shaliach Kabbalah, or that a shaliach Kabbalah is even less kal v'chomer than shaliach holacha. If that's how we understand, we'll be pasking according to Rabbi Ami, that an eved can be a shaliach, to be shliach Kabbalah for the woman, because we can learn kal v'chomer from the Mishnah. And the Rambam and the Rif and Rashi actually were pasking Rabbi Ami. But there's a machloket. Ramban and Chachmei Sfarad were pasling eved according to what Rabbi Yochanan said. And we might understand that the reason that they believe Rabbi Yochanan go for Rabbi Yochanan more than Rabbi Ami is because they think, like the Pnei Yoshua offered at the end of his statement, that Shliach Kabbalah is something much more radical than Shliach Holacha, and therefore, since the Mishnah spoke about Shliach Holacha, we cannot take that and learn from that to Shliach Kabbalah, because to say that a person can become the body of another person, that's Shliach Kabbalah, and that's much more radical than Shliach Holacha. We cannot learn the dinim from one to the other. So what we saw up till now is that learning about an Eved here is actually a way to understand, do we have here two different kinds of shlichuyot altogether? Or are the two shlichuyot of the same kind? And bichlal, is there a shlichut to become another person's body, which is the idea that the Pnei Yoshua brought forth in explaining Rabbi Yochanan. To finish the Gefet, I want to read with you Tosfot, which adds another perspective to these two figures that we saw, an Oved Kochavim and an Eved. Tosfot has an interesting question, and he asks, okay, we have all this discussion. There's a difference between the Mishnah that spoke about Oved Kochavim and the question that Rabbi Ami was asked, an Eved. Why all this headache? Why couldn't the Mishnah just write Eved in the list? Why did the Mishnah dafka speak about Akum and not Eved? ואם תאמר, says Tosfot, ומתניתין נתנה עבד וכל שכן עובד כוכבים. If Rabbi Yochanan is right, the Mishnah should have said, an Eved is pasul להביא את הגט, and we would have learned קל וחומר, if an Eved is pasul, so also an עובד כוכבים. וללישנא דאמר רבי יוחנן לאל זאת, התורה ניחא, דנקת עובד כוכבים למידק, דלעניין כתיבה, אפילו עובד כוכבים כשר. אבל להך לישנא דמוקר רבי יוחנן כרבי אליעזר קשה, מהך דרבי יוחנן דהכה. So what is Tosfot doing here? He's connecting us to the prior sugya. The prior sugya discussed a different question, whether or not Oved Kochavim is kasher to write the get or not. So there was a machloket, okay? And there were two different lishnot. One lishnot was that an Oved Kochavim can actually write a get, and another lishnot said that no, there's no way that an Oved Kochavim can write a get. So what the Tosfot says? If Rabbi Yochanan thinks that Oved Kochavim can write a get, that's why in the next Mishnah you had to say, even though an Oved Kochavim can write a get, you should know that he cannot bring the get. So I can understand that the Mishnah had to continue the statement that it dealt with before. But, says the Tosfot, if Rabbi Yochanan thinks that an Oved Kochavim cannot write a get, I don't understand why not to write here an Eved. That would have solved all the problems. That's an interesting question. Of Tosfot sees it's a literary question. Why did the Mishnah not write itself in an easier manner? And the answer, Omer Rabbeinu Tam, ונקט עובד כוכבים להשמועינן, עובד כוכבים הנתגייר פסול, אף על פי שבאותה שעה הייתה דעתו להתגייר. דהווה בעובד כוכבים רבות התפמים בעבד שאין בידו להשתחרר. Says Rabbanit Tam, if somebody is an Oved Kochavim or a Goy, the line between him and Judaism is much thinner than an Eved in some respect. Usually, as we know, we think of Avadim as much closer to Jews. Why? Because an Eved is actually half a Jew. Avdut, when somebody's an Eved, Eved Nani, so he's Tovel for Avdut, but he's Chayav b'mitzvot, like women on the lower level, and if he'll be Meshuchrar, he will then become a full Jew. So he's like half a Jew. And Oved Kochavim is not a Jew in any way. So we were used to think that an Oved Kochavim is much further away than a Goy in its connection to Judaism. But here, says Rabbanit Tam, you should notice that if a Goy wants to change his status, it's in his ability. It's only up to him. And therefore, in that sense, he's closer to become a Jew because it's in his mind and in his power to become a Jew. Oved Kochavim, אף על פי שבאותה שעה הייתה דעתו להתגייר, so it means that Oved Kochavim can actually decide to become a Jew. What difference does it make? Says Rabbanit Tam, if here we have a Goy, and actually he's thinking and saying now, wow, I want to become a Jew, and maybe he will become a Jew in a week. Still, the Mishnah has to say, even though you think that here we have a very thin line, as long as you're not a full Jew, you cannot bring the get. And that's why the Mishnah, Dafka, had to talk about an Oved Kochavim. Because an Eved, even though he's technically much closer to becoming a full Jew, it is not in his ability, and he won't be able to cross the line on his own. So we won't have a Hava Amina that if he wants to become a Jew and he wants to be Meshuchrar, that he'll actually be Meshuchrar. And there, even though the Eved wants to become a full Jew and the Goy wants to become a full Jew, the Eved is further from his desire than the Oved Kochavim. So since Oved Kochavim is closer to become a Jew, that's why the Mishnah had to dafka say that an Oved Kochavim cannot bring the get, even though he's planning on becoming a Jew, and maybe he'll even be a Jew in an hour. That's irrelevant as long as he's not a full Jew at this point. So what the Tosfot added to us is another diuk in the Mishnah. Why did the Mishnah dafka say Oved Kochavim and not say Eved? So what did we see here? Let's sum up the entire Gefet. We learned two different things, maybe even three. First, from the Pshat Mishnah and Gemara, we saw that we have Holacha, we have Kabbalah, and we saw that there are two different issues in order to become Shaliach. One, you have to become part of Israel in order to become a Shlichut, and two, you have to have the same technical halachic abilities in order to do a halachic deed that you want to do for another person. Let's see, if you can do it for yourself, that's when you can do it for another person. And that's the difference between Goyim and Avadim. Goyim are not bichlal part of Shlichut, and Avadim, they are part of Shlichut, but still we have to ask the second question. That was in Pshat Mishnah and Gemara. And then we said the Rishonim asked, what's this difference between the Mishnah and the question that Rabbi Ami was asked? Is there a meaning to the fact that Rabbi Ami is talking about Shliach Kabbalah and the Mishnah is talking about Shliach Holacha? And here we saw three shitot. We saw one shita, Rashi's shita, that it's exactly the same and there is no difference, and that's why Rabbi Ami didn't mention anything. But in the Pnei Yoshua, we saw different explanations that might explain also the machloket between the Rishonim. According to Rabbi Ami, a Shliach Holacha is much stronger than a Shliach Kabbalah, and that's why you can do Kal Vachomer for one to the other. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, Shliach Kabbalah is a much stronger and radical Shliach than Shliach Holacha, and that's why you cannot do a Kal Vachomer from one to the other. And we learned another thing from Tosfot. The reason that the Mishnah Dafka used Goy and didn't say Eved is because the Mishnah either connected to the Sugya before, or the Mishnah is talking about a line that is easier to cross for somebody who's not an Eved. If you're a Goy, you can cross the line into Judaism more easily because it has to do with your own will. And an Eved, even though he's half a Jew, he can never cross that line because of his own accord. He's always dependent on other people to make the decision for him. And therefore, even though he's closer in one respect, he's further in another respect, And that's why the Mishnah Dafka spoke about a goy and not about an Eved. Okay, so this was a little complicated, but I think also interesting. And what I hope that you felt here that the discussion about Eved and Goy is not only about Eved and Goy, it's about what kind of shichuyot we have here and what kinds of lines do we have in order to cross into Judaism. And a very interesting statement at the end of the Dvarim of the Tosfot that every Goy is really a Jew in potential because it's up to him or her to make that decision. So take care and continue enjoying your learning of Gittin, and Bezrat Hashem, we will meet again next week. Good Shabbos.